When Claire was little and woke up in the middle of the night, afraid, she'd come, pattering down the hallway and open the door, come up to the bed with her whispered fears. It was always a giant mouse that she was afraid of. I don't know why. And I'd carry her back to bed, and then I would tell her, Mommy's here, it's okay, go back to sleep. And now that she's much bigger, she doesn't ever come down. She's never home to come down with her fears anymore, right? But instead, I get sound guy got that working. What I get instead are phone calls, right? And I can tell as soon as she says, Mom, like you can, right? All moms are like nodding, like they know what that is, right? There's that timbre in the voice that you just recognize, right? That fear, that stress, that anxiety. And then as parents, we just listen. We just talk through with them, reassure our kids that we're there for them, that we hear them, that we know what it is, that we recognize what it is that they're afraid of, and that they're held and they're loved. Right? That's maybe one of the closest descriptions of what prayer could be, should be with God. God who is our Father, our mother, our parent, right? That we take to God those fears, those concerns, those stresses, those worries that we have, and share them. And I think even though this chapter of Luke isn't really structured as talking about our prayer life, what this chapter is it's reminding us to put our trust in God our Father, whose good pleasure, Jesus says, whose good pleasure it is to give us the kingdom, right? And throughout this section in Luke, Jesus keeps having this refrain of don't fear, don't be afraid, don't be anxious, right? Because that's kind of how our brains are hardwired in some ways, right? For fear, for anxiety. When you wake up in the middle of the night, you're not like, well, this is fantastic. I'm going to think all my thoughts, right? I'm so glad I get to spend all this extra time worrying. No, right? And I mean, studies show like at least 50% of us, right, don't have good sleep because of our worries and our stresses and our anxieties. Maybe not every night, but enough, right? Enough. There are some, it's not exactly true, but there are some who say that do not fear is the most repeated phrase in the Bible. Some even say that there are 365 times in the Bible that we're told, do not be afraid, right? One for every day of the year, right? To remind us. Because God doesn't want to leave us in that state of uncertainty and unsettledness and chaos and fear and stress, right? In some ways, we're geared that way. It was good for us when we were like cave people to have a certain amount of fear and stress and anxiety, right? Because it told us to remember that the furry creature with the big claws and teeth is not a teddy bear, right? But could eat us, right? Stay away. So our brains are kind of wired that way. But sometimes we stay in that heightened sense, that heightened uncertainty. And so we have this chapter of Jesus constantly saying to us, remember, trust in God. Trust in God. Don't worry about these things. Last week we had, if you were here, the parable of the rich fool, the guy who his farm gave him so much produce that he decided, I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store it up for me, and I'll say to my soul, eat, drink, be merry, which actually comes from the Bible, from the book of Proverbs. So he's actually saying something that God has said to us in another part of the Bible. Eat, drink, be merry, right? Only this time God's saying, you fool, you unwise one, you're alone. Who are you eating and drinking with? Your soul, that's it, right? What have you done? You've taken this abundance, and rather than saying to friends or family or your community, come join in with me in this abundance God has given me, instead you're like, mine, right? So much that one person was never going to be able to eat everything he stored. He could have sold it away and he still wouldn't be able to use all of the wealth that would have been generated from that. Right? You fool, God gives you this abundance not for yourself alone, but for us to recognize it as gift. Because what happens when we think it's all ours, right? We're like, oh, I've got a good amount of grain. I need more. I have enough to fill all my barns. I have extra. Let me buy a storage unit and pay $60 a month to keep the extra over there, right? And so what God wants us to do, what Jesus is trying to instruct us to do, is to shift our mind away from a constant worry about how we're going to take care of ourselves, how we're going to provide for ourselves, how we're going to live. Because what that really is it's a scarcity mindset that says, I don't have enough. I might not have enough. I have enough now, I might not have enough next year, right? And when we do that with grain, right? Or we do that with the size of our house or how many cars we have or whatever it is, we then sometimes extrapolate scarcity to other things in our life, like people and relationships. And we think we don't have enough to take care of everybody. We don't have enough so that we can share with everybody. We don't have enough food or homes or security or money or wealth or love. When we treat those things as commodities, we want to hoard them like this. Okay? That's what the rich fool did last week. Okay? He hoarded. And he was alone. And he didn't have any love in his life, and he didn't have any God in his life, and he didn't have any community in his life. Okay? Jesus' antidote to that kind of scarcity mindset, that kind of anxiety, that kind of fear, is to trust in your Father's good pleasure, right? To trust in God. Last week's story and this week's story, we skipped over the beautiful little bit that says, where Jesus says, the sort of consider the flowers of the field, right? Consider the birds. They don't work, they don't reap or sow or harvest or struggle or strive, but God takes care of them. And aren't you of more value? Won't God take care of you? That's what you should strive for. Strive for a greater awareness of God moving in your life. Look for God. That's what the end of this week's passage is, with the thief coming in the night and the master coming home late from a wedding banquet. It's look for God. Are you aware of God working in your life? Because when you are, you'll see him. You'll see him, and you'll recognize everything that God wants for you. And Jesus tells us to be ready for that. And interestingly enough, he also tells us that one of the things we need to do to be ready for God is to sell our possessions and give alms. And that can sound like sell everything, right? Which pretty much every American is going to be like, I'm not coming back to church ever again. But Jesus knows that when we start to worship our possessions, when we start to hoard them and count them and see how ours measures up to our neighbors or our neighbor in the next town, or we're afraid, right? We begin to worship those possessions instead of worshiping God. Okay? That's what Jesus means, to sell our possessions. Right? And to give alms, right? Because giving alms is another way of recognizing that God has blessed you with something, blessed you with abundance. And your responsibility is to give that away, to share that abundance. Okay? Because Jesus knows that when we're hoarding things and where you're holding on to things, can we receive God's gifts in our hands when they're tight like this? No. So Jesus tells us to open them. Give. Watch. Receive. Because it is the Father's good pleasure that you will receive God's kingdom.